right, let's just make sure it's all working. I think we're good to go. Hi, everyone. My name is Tara. I'm Al-Shabaka's US Policy Fellow. Thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to another episode of Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab series. So today we're going to be having a particularly timely discussion about Israel's military-industrial complex and how Israel is using Palestinians as unwilling test subjects for increasingly deadly weapon systems that are now being exported around the world. So you've probably already heard a lot about these weapons and surveillance technologies over recent months, from Pegasus spyware to attack drones to AI targeting systems. Israel has become a leading exporter of increasingly advanced tools of subjugation and oppressive forces across the globe. Israeli spyware, for example, has been used to hack the phones of journalists. Israeli weapons were used by the Myanmar army to massacre thousands of Rohingya. And Israeli drone technology has now been seen in multiple countries across sub-Saharan Africa, just to name a handful of examples. And for more than 10 months now, Israel has been testing out advanced AI targeting systems to streamline the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. So today in this policy lab, I'll be joined by Marwa Fatafta and Anthony Lowenstein to discuss what Israel's rapidly expanding military-industrial complex means for Palestinians and for the rest of the world. Marwa is a Shabaka policy analyst and leads Access Now's policy and advocacy work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa. Her work spans a number of issues at the nexus of human rights and technology, including content governance and platform accountability, online censorship, surveillance, and transnational repression. Marwa is also an advisory board member of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and an advisory committee member for Bread and Net. Anthony is an independent journalist, author, filmmaker, and co-founder of Declassified Australia. He's written for The Guardian, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, just to name a few. His books include the global bestseller, The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World, and My Israel Question. So before we get into it, just a quick reminder about the format. I'll be posing questions for the first 45 minutes or so, and then we'll save about 15 minutes at the end just to get to questions from you, the audience. So please feel free throughout the conversation to submit your questions by clicking the Ask a Question button, which I believe is on the bottom of your screen. And remember, you can also vote on questions that you find particularly important. And we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible with the limited, unfortunately, time that we have. So let's jump into it. Anthony, I want to start with you. I was hoping you could kind of situate us within the current context and describe kind of the growth of Israel's weapons industry over recent years and how they've actually become a kind of leading global arms exporter over recent years.
Yeah, thanks, Tariq and Marwa. It's wonderful to be here in obviously very grim circumstances. Let me give people a brief overview of where things are at in terms of the Israeli arms industry. Israel is probably the 9th or 10th biggest arms dealer in the world. US is number one, America about 40-45% of the arms industry globally. Last year in 2023, the global arms industry was worth over $2 trillion US. So it's an insane amount of money and it's going up every year. So Israel's about 9th or 10th. But it's probably number one per capita in surveillance equipment. Surveillance meaning Pegasus and other tools like that. Pegasus obviously is the most well known, but there are many, many others. And Israel's really had an arms industry, a successful arms industry from its perspective, pretty much from the late 40s when Israel was founded, but it accelerated in the 50s and really took off after 1967. And Israel's been using the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem as a testing ground for decades. We're talking about drones, spyware, AI-enabled warfare, particularly obviously in Gaza since October 7. And in some ways, I see the Israeli arms industry, yes, obviously on the one hand, it's to make Israel and its companies money. It's partly financial. But actually, I think it's far more than that. It's also ideological. And also I see it as an insurance policy in a way that for many, many years, even countries that publicly are opposing what Israel's doing long before October 7, because of the occupation, because of settlements, whatever it may be, are often also buying weapons or defense equipment or offensive weapons. And my fear is, even though there are many countries, particularly in the global south, since October 7 that have been very critical of Israel, history would suggest that many of those nations, unless pressure is put on them, will fast forward 2, 3, 4 months or a year, will go back to buy more Israeli weapons or spyware, some of which have been tested in Gaza. So the Israeli arms industry just finally is having, if you follow the industry, unfortunately, as I do quite closely, including in the Israeli business press, the arms industry is doing very well financially. If there is a belief that October 7 showed, as it should have, in a logical, sensible way, that all this infrastructure of control and surveillance failed miserably, there's no other way to view that. It's had no impact, at least so far, on many of the companies, Elbit, IAI, huge amounts of others, in making huge amounts of not just sales to the Israeli government, because Israel is increasingly trying to build a much bigger arms industry domestically. There's a fear among some that if there's global arms embargoes or something, that Israel has the ability to produce more weapons locally, but also huge amounts of nations globally, including in Europe after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Virtually every European country came begging to Israel, fearful, rightly or otherwise, about potential invasion by Russia or Putin, and they're buying huge amounts of missile defense shields and other kinds of weapons. So the Israeli arms industry, without an arms embargo, I would argue, is going to remain in pretty good shape.
And Anthony, could I stick with you on one more thing? Could you tell us a little bit more about how October 7th impacted, I
Mm,
guess, Israel's, arms industry? Because like you mentioned it, it kind of, the fact that Hamas was able to kind of break through
mm,
Israel's, quote unquote best defense system. And we
yeah,
obviously know that their military was kind of, very much focused on protecting settlers going on rampages in the West Bank,
the
and there was
West
a lot of
Bank.
hubris involved. But could you tell us a little bit about kind of like the technicalities behind how they were able to break through this supposedly, unbreakable technology, and why that hasn't deterred buyers from relying on this type of Israeli tech, considering the fact that it was kind of broken through.
I think a lot of the purchases of Israeli weapons is not solely for this reason, but it's partly as a way for states to show solidarity with Israel. I'm talking about Western states, especially. Now, obviously, if all the tech failed, I don't think they would simply buy it out of loyalty to Israel or Zionism. I think it's more complicated than that. But I think many states still view, for example, if Israel is selling missile defense shields to European countries, they are viewed, inverted commas, as working. They are, I mean, it's interesting that many European nations, from Finland and others, have bought these technologies in the last few years. Sort of, some of them are partly based on Iron Dome, some of them are not. And the range of countries that want to still buy that technology is increasing every year. I mean, last year, the biggest arms deal in Israel's history was with Germany in September, just before October 7, about 3.5 billion US dollars. Massive deal. And the latest figures we have for the Israeli arms industry for 2023, which came out a few months ago, was 13.1 billion US dollars, the highest on record by far, by far. And that included European nations, countries in Asia, who see the Israeli architecture as appealing. Now, just briefly, your question, Tariq, about October 7. Yes, you're right. As I said, anyone looking at that sanely would see that, and I've spent, my book talks about this, and I've done other research looking at the so-called surveillance architecture that is around Gaza, particularly on the Israeli side, but also the Egyptian side. And on paper, it seemed pretty good from the Israeli perspective. It seemed pretty good. I think what has been very clear though is that Israel made the fatal error that they overly relied. I mean, putting aside, as you said, politically, a lot of troops had gone to the West Bank. They were asleep at the wheel. There was a Jewish holiday. There's all these factors, but I think a lot of it was tech arrogance, this belief somehow that you could use technology to, inverted commas, manage your problems, manage the Palestinians, make them go away, deter them, is delusional. And it's interesting because obviously, in many ways, Israel has tried to build a network of people, spies, etc., in Gaza. We don't really know how many of those people exist. There's obviously a small number of people, often, as they say in the book, are blackmailed to do that role because they want to leave Gaza for medical care or education, whatever. I think Israel is facing a real crisis. I mean, that's obvious, but a crisis of defense, that they are increasingly realizing that their forms of trying to defend their very porous borders is not working. It did not work in Gaza. And I think what you're seeing now in the Israeli arms industry and high-tech sector is really, I remember there was a tweet by Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, who I think has aspirations to lead again. And he sort of said, and I think this summarizes so much of what I'm seeing in the Israeli tech sector. He said, we being Israel, need to become a high-tech Sparta. It's that mindset. Essentially a ghettoized nation, which means both in a literal sense, higher and higher and higher walls, far more surveillance, far more occupation. And if you have the West supporting that, and of course it's ironic as someone who's Jewish myself, who hears that kind of language, that the whole idea of Zionism in the first place was to try to get away from the European ghetto and build a state in the Middle East, and obviously based on ethnic cleansing and apartheid, of course. And here we are in 2024, and the so-called vision of Bennett and many, frankly, is to build that ghetto, to deepen that ghetto. But I think that Bennett comment, it's one tweet, is very symptomatic of what I'm seeing in many of the Israeli defense sector, because they see it now as a patriotic duty to build more weapons, more surveillance. In other words, my duty as a Zionist, this is what they're saying, not me, is to develop these tools of repression and technology and to use what they're testing in Gaza, as they already are doing, to sell at global arms fairs. And I'm seeing evidence of that in global arms fairs in the last 10 months, from Paris to Singapore, literally saying we're selling battle-tested weapons that's been used in Gaza since October 7.
Thanks, Sanjay. I think that's the perfect segment. Marwa, I want to bring you in, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about and this really isn't new. We've been hearing about how Israel has been testing its both weapon systems and surveillance technology on Palestinians, both in the West Bank and Gaza for years, if not decades now. Could you tell us a little bit about this history of Palestinians kind of serving as unwilling test subjects? Both looking back over the years, and then maybe a little bit about what we're seeing in Gaza now, just because of kind of these horror stories of new AI tech being used in Gaza as we speak.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Tariq, and Al-Shabaka for putting this together, and Anthony, great to be joined by you again. I think Anthony already alluded to the fact that Palestinians in Gaza is a prime example of being a laboratory or a battle or a test ground for the Israeli military, and also by extension of that, the private sector to test and prototype and enhance all sorts of technologies, from surveillance to other types of military and military tech and weaponry, etc. And going back a few decades or to the history of how Israel needs this surveillance apparatus as an integral part of its occupation and system of apartheid, by creating a multi-tier ID system that ties Palestinians to certain geographical areas, which Anthony rightly referred to as ghettos, and using low and high-tech surveillance systems and tools in order to monitor, track, and control the movement and the activity of Palestinians wherever they exist in the occupied territories. And I would argue that, I've always said that Israel has been a surveillance state pretty much since its inception, even before and during the British Mandate, by surveying all Palestinians and their way of living, their religious beliefs, family ties, societal systems, etc., in order to understand and occupy and control the Palestinians and destroy even the Palestinian society. Now, moving on to the last few years, Israel has been experimenting with all sorts of technologies, primarily with biometric surveillance technologies. We've heard, for example, a couple of years ago of the so-called Blue Wolf systems. It's an app that the Israeli soldiers use in order to identify Palestinians based on facial recognition technology. So if you're a Palestinian living in the West Bank or, for example, in Hebron, where some of these systems have been first revealed by the Washington Post, the soldier can use this app in order to identify you at a distance and also flag whether you can be a suspect or based on some traffic light system. So if the system or the app lights red, it means that you're a threat. Green, it means that you can pass through the checkpoint. It was also revealed by Amnesty that Israel also uses another similar system called Red Wolf, and that's installed in public spaces and at checkpoints where you can also be identified by the Israeli army upon passing. Now, after October 7th, I would say that Israel has moved from this experimental phase into normalizing and expanding those systems. Right now, for example, if you drive through the West Bank, it has become a common standard. So we're not just talking about these systems being used in East Jerusalem or being tested in Hebron, in the old city of Hebron, but they're used at almost every checkpoint, whether permanent or, as we say here, a flying checkpoint where soldiers request Palestinian drivers to stop and show their ID. I've seen it, firsthand. They use technologies to read license plates, facial recognition systems, and of course, the invasion of Gaza presented a prime opportunity for the Israeli military to expand their facial recognition or biometric surveillance database to include those that are present in Gaza, which was not possible before. This is not to say that Gaza, was outside the Israeli military's surveillance reach. Quite the opposite. I think important to remember that Gaza, has been controlled, as Anthony said, with a lot of AI enabled and high tech tools at the borders, but also, Israel has kept the Gaza population using 2G networks, which are extremely unsafe, easily interceptable, which means that the Israeli military and intelligence can intercept people's messages and communications anytime they want. And as has been revealed during this genocide, that Israel does have access to people's data, almost the entire 2.3 million population of Gaza. And we've seen the evil use of such data for genocidal purposes, whether it be the use of this data for live tracking. It's been revealed, of course, and now that's public knowledge about AI systems such as Lavender, which allows the Israeli military to automatically generate targets. Tied to that is Where is Daddy, a system that allows the Israeli military to track their targets in real time and bomb them as soon as they enter their families' homes. We've also heard about the gospel, and talking about the moving from the experimental phase to the intensification or the normalization phase. The systems like the gospel, for example, are not new. They've been first used and tested in Gaza during the May war in 2021. And there were, some snippets of information and facts about that through statements from IDF, either command or the IDF blog, whenever they want to boast of their AI capabilities, and referring, for example, to the May 2021 Gaza war as the first AI war. Now we've seen the optimal impact and utilization of these systems, resulting in the mass slaughter of Palestinians, including women and children. Adding to that, of course, is the use of quadcopters, drones. If you watch Al Jazeera, for example, live, there's not a single minute or even a second where you don't hear the surveillance drones humming and buzzing above Gazans. And of course, and I also want to mention here that with all these technologies, Israel still relies on old school surveillance systems, such as informants and blackmailing people, especially if they find out that there is a weak point through which they can target an individual, whether they are homosexual or queer, or they have a financial need or a health need, or you have marital sex affairs or whatever, in order to blackmail these individuals to collaborate with the Israeli occupation. The Israeli military or the Israeli intelligence apparatus in general does not spare any tactic in order to surveil and gather as much surveillance, as much personal data on Palestinians, obviously without their consent, obviously without their knowledge. Often, as I said, these technologies are deployed in particular points, either in East Jerusalem or in Hebron, and then you see them being normalized and used at a systematic level. And a time when we talk about personal data protection and privacy in Palestine, in occupied Palestine, none of these standards exist. And so for Israel, it's really a free ride for the Israeli military and the private sector to experiment as much as they would like on Palestinian subjects, and as Anthony already mentioned, sell those to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Marwan. I fear that it's not just Israel who's kind of using this as an opportunity to test out new technology, but we keep hearing about major corporations like Amazon, Google, who are partnering with the Israeli military. Could you tell us a little, Marwa, maybe if we could stick with you for this one, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about what that looks like, that those partnerships look like in practice, and what kind of pushback there's being in terms of actual activism?
Sure. Let me preface by saying that, as Anthony mentioned, Israel does rely quite a lot on its high-tech industry. According to recent data from the Israeli authorities, I think high-tech accounts for almost 20% of Israel's GDP. High-tech industry also accounts for over 50% of Israel's exports in 2023. And that, of course, requires not only buyers, but also investors and other companies, whether there's capital, venture capital, private funds, or big tech companies that are willing and able to provide, for example, cloud computing services or AI capabilities for the Israeli military to run its AI systems or its surveillance systems. And as a matter of fact, it's companies like Google and Amazon which have signed a tender contract with the Israeli government known as Project Nimbus. And these companies, of course, kept the contract secret, so we don't know precisely what types of services they provide for the Israeli military, but you can connect the dots. And so we know, for example, that now outside Project Nimbus, the Israeli military is using Google Photos in Gaza in order to identify, for its facial recognition system, in order to identify and detain Palestinians. And we know of thousands of Palestinians who've been detained, kidnapped even, and held in secretive detention centers in inhumane conditions, being naked, stripped, and tortured and treated in a very inhumane and undignified manner, and even raped, as we now recently know. So there's just one tiny example of how these systems that are publicly available for everyone are used and exploited by the Israeli military. But now, going back to Project Nimbus, we know, for example, that the Israeli military and the Israeli Ministry of Defense are part of this government consortium that are responsible for overseeing the project. We know also, for example, that during this war in March, the Israeli military tried to expand its contract with Google. And as we now know from a 972 magazine investigation, which finally ended this back and forth with companies, because obviously we have been contacting Google and Amazon, demanding answers and transparency on the types of services they're providing the Israeli military during this genocide. A company like Google insists that their services and their contract provided to the Israeli government is only for civilian use, which is of course complete BS. And we know through this investigation that Israel has collected so much data about Palestinians in Gaza that it needed more cloud storage. So it had to forsake, or it had to rely on civilian cloud computing systems provided by big tech companies like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft Azure in order to store this data that has been collecting and the intelligence that it has been collecting on Palestinians in Gaza. Now I want to say that, you know, these companies, whether they admit to the extent in which they are directly participating in the genocide in Gaza by providing material and technical solutions and support to the Israeli military, or through negligence. You know, we know, for example, that Lavender, the AI system in which Israel uses to automate targets in the Gaza Strip, relies on metadata generated or used by WhatsApp. And there's been question marks about the extent to which a company like the mother company of WhatsApp is providing that information to the Israeli government. And I think here some of these big tech companies are being complicit by acts of negligence. You know, when you know that your applications or your platforms are generating metadata that can be exploited by intelligence or a military, then you can and should provide or tweak your systems in a way that makes this data unavailable. You know, an app like Signal, for instance, does not collect metadata on individuals. And even though activists like myself and many of the organizations that work on digital rights have raised this directly, publicly with the company to say, now that this information has become available to you, what are you doing? The answer is nothing. And so these big tech companies are either see in Israel a lucrative business opportunity and provide, as I said, technological AI capabilities, cloud service to the Israeli military, despite the very great and long and extensive record of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And also, let's not forget, for these companies, you know, at the end of the day, these are companies that feed and swell on people's data and surveillance capitalism. And so it's also a win-win situation for them. And at the same time, these companies have failed to take their responsibilities. You know, there is a system out there, even at this point, people don't believe in international law anymore because it has proved futile and to stop crimes from happening or prevent crimes. But at least there is that system in which companies are responsible to ensure that their products, their policies, their systems do not contribute to human rights abuses, and that they have a responsibility to identify those risks before happening and mitigate them. When it comes to Palestine, and mind you, companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, they all subscribe to this framework, which is known as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. They all have corporate human rights policies. They all have shiny AI principles. For example, one of Google's AI principles that it will never allow its AI systems to be used for military purposes or to be involved in human rights abuses or systematic violations of international law. When it comes to Palestine and Gaza in specific now, you see all these rules are being thrown out of the window simply for profit. What can we do about it? I don't know if you want me to answer this question now or if you want to keep this for the end of the conversation. Should I press ahead?
Yeah, I think why not? And then I think there's a couple like side questions that I'll want to add on to it later, but go ahead if you want to, and then I'll have a question for Anthony, kind of about specifically about AI, but for sure.
I think so. There are a few things that we can do. It's a multi-prong strategy, if you may. I mean, one of which is we have spent quite a lot of time, people like Anthony, myself, and many other researchers working on these issues in establishing very clear links between the Israeli military tech industry and the Israeli occupation and the exporting of repression worldwide, whether it be by selling surveillance technologies, spyware, training of military and police personnel in the US and in the EU, etc. And that we need to continue cementing these linkages for public awareness, because you cannot, for example, dismantle or tackle the international surveillance industry without dismantling Israel's occupation and apartheid regime. So, for example, we didn't discuss Pegasus as much, but Pegasus is one of those notorious spyware that has sprung from the Israeli occupation and has proliferated worldwide. The company has many government clients, democratic and authoritarian alike, in the EU. Even it's been revealed also, I believe it was the FBI that had a prototype system. Now, it's not clear whether it actually has used it, but at least we know that many governments around the world use or have used Pegasus to spy and attack journalists and human rights defenders and lawyers in their countries, or even their nationals living abroad. And the conversation has moved so long to the extent that the Biden administration, for example, has taken steps in order to tackle the proliferation of commercial spyware. There's been a joint statement initiated by the Biden administration, has many countries joining, in which countries unite their efforts to tackle the proliferation of spyware. The EU Parliament has set up something called the Pegasus Committee last year or in 2022 in order to investigate the use of Pegasus and other similar spyware used in the EU, etc., etc. And all of that is great, but you won't be able to really tackle that proliferation of spyware and surveillance without tackling the Israeli apartheid and occupation, which allows for these technologies to spring and to flourish. So that's number one. And number two, it's the other way around. I think, as I said, the Israeli weapons and military tech system doesn't exist in isolation. It does rely on exports. As I said, it constitutes over half of Israeli exports, at least for 2023, and almost 48% in 2022. And I agree with Anthony that this is going to continue as long as the world is obsessed with AI, as long as policymakers see in these technologies as a silver bullet solutions to societal and economic problems, and as long as big tech companies are there selling to policymakers and to everyday users that their technologies are going to transform their world. So as long as these trends continue, we're going to see more and more of that. And at the same time, these companies, Israeli tech companies, rely on foreign investment. And I think there, we need to interrogate not only the role of big tech, but also the role of these investors, whether it be private, capital, venture capital funds, private firms, or publicly traded investors that pump blood and money into these systems. One example I can think of, for instance, is an Israeli drones manufacturer called Extent, which has been heavily used in the current war in Gaza. Some of its personnel is serving in the IDF, and the company has publicly stated that it is 100% behind the IDF in its military genocidal war on Gaza. And this company has said that because of the use of its drones in the war, it has managed to raise around 40 million US dollars in investment. And there's also been reports, I think by Declassified UK, which showed that the British Army is currently, or in December last year, was trialing and testing the drones manufactured by this company. So that's just one simple example out of many that shows these linkages between the Israeli military industry and public or not public investment. I'll get into that in a bit, but the public use of these technologies and the private investment in them. And lastly, I want to say we do need to investigate and hold accountable the public investment in these technologies. For example, the EU has been funding a number of Israeli drone and military or weapons manufacturing companies. For example, this company I've mentioned, Extend, had received from the EU Horizon project, I think a grant of 50,000 euros in order to do research into drones. Other Israeli companies, Rafael, Israeli aerospace industries have also received hundreds of thousands of euros from the EU into researching these types of technologies that we know are used for military purposes, as we see now in Gaza. So I think we do need to investigate and make very clear these linkages, and also put pressure not only on having an embargo on the exports of arms to the Israeli army or the Israeli government, and as well as financial funding to the Israeli government, but also what's happening at that mid or low level between companies or between research institutes and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Marwa. Anthony, I want to turn to you, but kind of stay on a similar vein. But I'm kind of now wondering how this incorporation of AI into these advanced weapon systems kind of changes these dynamics of oppression and control, both within occupied Palestine and wherever else these weapons are going to be deployed. How do you see that shifting from what we're looking at now versus what we were looking at maybe even a year ago? And does this kind of does this incorporation of AI take the Israel's, I guess, arms industry to a new level in many ways?
Cautious in, not you particularly, Tarek, in your question, but in general in this conversation, about presuming that we're at a situation now where the Israeli military is solely relying on AI to kill Palestinians. That is not, as far as I'm aware, the case. This is not to excuse the IDF 1 second, of course. My point in saying that is that there is so much boosterism around AI at the moment, either in a cultural sense, but also in a military sense. I mean, you read day after day after day articles about the use of AI in the war in Ukraine. It's ubiquitous over there as well. It's also a massive testing ground for the US and Ukrainians, as it is, of course, in Gaza for the Israelis. It's clear from both reporting in Israeli press and also people I've spoken to that, yes, what AI is doing is, for the IDF in Gaza, is allowing mass processing of information on individuals to make decisions, so to speak, on targets. And in the first 3 or 4 months of the war after October 7, the sheer massive scale of deaths was basically had a lot to do with very little time being used on picking targets, and therefore massive amounts of civilians were killed. And the evidence for that, of course, is overwhelming. Deliberately, not as a byproduct of the war, a deliberate strategy to try to instill fear in the population in the deluded hope that Gazans would overthrow Hamas. I mean, that was stated regularly, and also people I spoke to as well. I mean, the danger, of course, in what Israel is doing is that I'm already seeing various writings and comments in the US venture capital market, again, what I read from my fun times for work, that they're very interested in this. And in fact, increasingly, as the possibility of certain companies and countries not investing in Israel because of their position on the genocide, because of their political sway, whatever it may be, US venture capital, particularly from Silicon Valley, is unbelievably interested in what's happening in a positive way in Gaza. A lot of the ability for Israeli defense companies to raise money in the last 10 months has come not solely from the US, but principally from venture capital, from Silicon Valley. That's for a combination of reasons. Yes, from business decisions. And again, I think it comes from those who want to support Israel, who see Israel being isolated in parts of the international stage and see it as their patriotic duty as an American, as a potential American Jew, as an American conservative, as an American Democrat, whatever your position may be, to support Israel. And supporting Israel can mean supporting the weapons that they're using in their way to defend Israel. That's obviously how they view it. So I see the real danger in AI of being a situation where, and I've spoken to people who say that within 1 or 2 years, you will see in other global conflicts similar type AI weapons and targeting used. Will it have the same inverted commas sophistication other places? I don't know. Of course, I can't be 100% sure of that, but you will see that because there are many, many nations that I know of that are very interested in what Israel has been doing in Gaza, partly because of the technology, but also, as I've said for years, what Israel sells is not just the technology, it's the idea of getting away with it. It is such an important part of what Israel is selling. They're not so much selling that for money, they're selling the idea and the tactics and the strategies of doing so, whether it's AI or more traditional weapons. So many nations and armies look to Israel with profound admiration and say, how do you get away with it? How do you kill 40,000, 50,000 Palestinians? And basically, there's no sanction. I mean, no one's stopping Israel from doing this. No one. The US certainly is not. The EU certainly is not. There are certainly terse statements coming out from, I don't know, random country X and Y, and we read in the media that Kamala Harris and Biden are deeply concerned, which is meaningless because they're still seeing the weapons. So the idea of getting away with it and selling that ability and tactics and techniques, I think, is central to how AI will be promoted. Not just the technology, but the ability to implement that I think Israel is also selling. So again, we focus so much, I think, in the West, particularly on trying to stop correctly the US, the EU, particularly Germany, sending weapons to Israel since October 7. That's a legitimate campaign to be sure. We focus far less on what Israel is exporting. Far less. In fact, there's virtually, I would argue, barely any discussion about that in the international arena. Without US weapons, this war would not be happening in Gaza. That's obvious. And intelligence. But as Marwa has correctly said, the Israeli economy is hugely reliant on the Israeli defense and high-tech sector. Unless there is a way to challenge that, curtail that, embargo that, whatever it may be, this will not change. And AI is just the latest sort of high-tech weapon that Israel has been using in Gaza. But again, I'm just cautious in saying that we prescribe too much automation to a system which is still massively dictated by Israeli humans making decisions about who lives and dies.
Thanks, Anthony. I have one more question I want to ask, and I want to hear from both of you before we maybe open up to audience questions. We have two in the chat, but I'm kind of wondering what these developments, both in terms of the technical advancements of AI weapon and just other weapons, and the fact that, Anthony, I think it's interesting that you say Israel has pioneered a way of getting away with it, and that's something that other countries are particularly interested in. What does all of this mean for the future of collective organizing, and for, I guess, resistance, both by Palestinians in Palestine and us abroad? past couple of months, we've seen student protests pop up at universities across the country. What does it mean for them in terms of both tactics and technology being applied to suppress them? Anthony, maybe we could start with you, and then Marwa, you could close us off before we answer some audience questions.
Yeah, I'll give a short answer because I know we're running out of time. I mean, there's a few things there just that come to mind. One, there is already, I'm seeing and hearing reports of massive Israeli government interest in a huge campaign to surveil much more than in the past pro-Palestine activists, protesters, whether they're Palestinian, Jewish, whoever they are, in the US especially. That is seen as a profound threat. The fact that growing numbers of young Americans, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, atheist, whatever, according to the polls for months, and this was, by the way, the case before October 7, are increasingly in large numbers turning against Israel, is seen as a major problem for Israel. Therefore, I mean, I was reading this recently that Israel is talking to Black Cube, that surveillance intelligence gathering company run by the Mossad, former Mossad, to try to gather intel on pro-Palestine protesters in the US. In other words, how to try to interrupt them, disrupt them, etc., particularly because of the encampments across US campuses. I mean, to me, what is needed is harnessing the massive international campaign that has grown up mostly organically because of the genocide, and harnessing that into trying to impose economic pain. Without economic pain on Israel and Israelis, this will not change. And that, to me, could be as simple, in inverted commas, as making it impossible for Israeli settlers to travel freely in Europe. That, to me, is, I often heard when I lived in Palestine for many years, that this is just seen as normal. Israeli settlers want to go to Cyprus for holidays. Now, the fact that they have to apply for a visa to a country doesn't end the occupation. I'm not suggesting it does, but it's imposing economic costs on illegal activity. The EU and the US obviously have imposed sanctions on about 6 settlers, and I have no problem with that. That's a great start. But as we all know, they're ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the Israeli state that funds and backs and supports these people. There needs to be massive increase, I think, in organizing around targeting and pressuring governments to impose not just greater sanctions on individuals and governments, but also arms companies, defense companies, putting pressure on venture capital in the US. I mean, as we see increasing with climate change and the global, well, I guess the climate crisis really, that more and more investment firms will not invest in oil and gas. Some do, many do not. That was unimaginable 15 years ago. Unimaginable. That has changed. And the same sort of tactics that we use to achieve that, in my view, need to be more and more imposed on Israeli defense companies and companies in the US, Amazon, and others. And obviously there is No Tech for Apartheid and other wonderful groups who are campaigning against those tech companies who are complicit with Israel. That needs to increase. So that the harnessing of public protest, encampments, etc., needs to be, in my view, harnessed to much more focus on imposing and pressuring for economic pain. Economic pain, in my view, historically, is the only thing that really changes behavior. Not feelings, economic pain. And a lot of Israeli and Palestinian friends of mine, and you guys would know this very, very well, will say exactly the same thing. This is not simply my view. This is what happened in South Africa. South African apartheid didn't end because of a feeling. It ended because of economic pain and cultural isolation. That's the only way this will end, or at least evolve and change, in my view. And I think many people would agree with that.
Maro, would you like to close us off, and then we can see if we have time for some audience questions?
I mean, sure. Very quickly, to build on Anthony's notion of Israel selling an experience, not just a piece of tech or a weapon. One thing that I've noticed post-October 7th is the weaponization of the Hamas attack by Israeli companies, including, for example, NSO Group, to tell, first of all, for fear-mongering, and to tell particularly the EU and the US that these technologies are exactly why, or, the Hamas attack is exactly why these governments need to have their technologies. So with the rise of fascism, the meltdown of liberal institutions and rights, civil and political rights, the mass crackdown on freedom of expression, on the right to peaceful assembly and association that we see in real time in the EU and in the US, I would expect seeing more and more of surveillance and the use of Israeli surveillance technologies being used on pro-Palestinian protesters. And so I think for protesters and organizers out there, we need to be awake and prepared for that situation or escalation of Israel's export of surveillance technologies and tactics in order to police and extend the repression on pro-Palestinian protesters. I think the post of September 11th attack and the expansion and mushrooming of counterterrorism industry, I suspect that we'll see similar rise and mushrooming of similar tactics and technologies of Israel to the West. And so I think that's a front that we need to be prepared for. And just quickly adding to also, again, to emphasize on the need of exposing investment in Israeli technologies. And I also want to say and emphasize, we're not only talking about, companies that sell drones that snipe and gun down people, or zero-click types of spyware, that spy on your phone, but also companies that sell, security systems and cyber defense systems for airports and hospitals, but do hail and come from the oppression and the occupation of Palestinians. And those also need to be exposed and sanctioned, because as far as I'm concerned, these companies, you need to look at the entire supply chain. And if the company comes from an environment where the rights of Palestinians, including their right to privacy, has been violated systematically and time again in order to come to and arrive at this type of technology that you can deploy peacefully at a hospital in the US, those types of companies need to be investigated and also sanctioned. And so I think, we need to, again, be holistic in our approach. Support tech workers. We haven't talked about the No Tech for Apartheid, but really they do deserve a massive shout out because without them, we wouldn't also have known a lot of the way these companies are and have been complicit in Israel's crimes. And so we do need a multi-prong and also a multi-sector approach to this phenomena or to this problem, from investor advocates to tech workers to people protesting on the streets to the BDS movement and so on and so forth, in order to dismantle a deeply entrenched global system, which Israel is a huge plays a huge role in.
Thank you. Thanks to you both. It looks like we do have a couple questions in the chats and in the question section. And I think I kind of want to combine two of them into one and see if we can do that. But someone raises the issue of the phenomenon of training, as it's not just actual physical technologies. It's actually Israeli Israeli forces are training actual personnel in countries like Mexico, for example. Anthony, could you talk a little bit about that as just like a way that it's kind of just like widening this umbrella of Israel's arms and suppression industry, and how that is kind of realizing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make it brief. I mean, this obviously has been happening long before 9/11. I mean, there's history. I talk about this in my book extensively, that Israel was very much sending trainers around the world pretty much from the 50s, but definitely after 1967, to many nations that wanted to get experience in so-called counterterrorism from Israel after its years of experience of doing so in the West Bank and Gaza against Palestinians. Obviously, it changed a bit after 9/11. And obviously, it's got a bit of attention in the last years in relation to the growing exchanges between US police and Israeli police forces, but it's far broader than that. I mean, there's evidence, huge evidence, of Israel training forces, Indian forces, including some who are deployed in Kashmir, obviously committing huge abuses. And I think one of the things about the exchanges in Mexico too, absolutely, and of course Mexico is remarkably the world's most prolific user of Pegasus. It's absolutely remarkable how Mexico, you wouldn't necessarily think that. I mean, and it was started under a right-wing government. It's continued under left-wing governments. This is bipartisan. It doesn't really matter in a way. It was probably used maybe more during the right-wing era, but it's been used in the left-wing era as well. And I think the issue of training is, there was a campaign run by Jewish Voice for Peace, Deadly Exchange, in the last 5 years, trying to draw attention to the growing connection between American police forces and Israel. And obviously, as they say, and this is correct, American police don't need to go to Israel to be racist. I mean, obviously not all police in America are racist, but the racism is deep-seated in the US, doesn't have to come from Israel. But it's not just training, it's also ideological. I've spoken to people who have been on these trainings, and partly it's an ideological alignment. There is an admiration often by American police for how Israel treats Palestinians, either within Israel proper or within Palestine. And that sort of information sharing, I think, contributes to this belief of impunity that exists, obviously, in the Israeli army and police, but also, frankly, in much of the American police force. So I think alerting people to those exchanges is important, and putting pressure on police forces, finally, some of which have stopped those trainings, have been receptive to pressure. And I think more police forces in the US should be pressured to stop those exchanges immediately.
Thanks, Anthony. We're just about out of time, but Marwa, if you have any closing words just on what we should be doing, maybe we could leave it there as kind of a positive, looking forward message to the rest of us who are kind of freaking out with the dystopian nature of all of this.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm having a problem with my mic. I always have to follow the link after saying surveillance, because often people do freak out. But I think really now is the time to organize, and now is the time more than ever to build on internationalist approach to the Palestinian struggle. Given everything that we've discussed and the linkages between Israeli oppression and surveillance in occupied Palestine, and how that translates and exports, whether it be on the US-Mexico border, or I'm now reminded of Trump. While preparing for this webinar, I read a comment or a quote from him that discussing the US-Mexico border, saying, look at Israel, they build a wall and it's solved their problem like 99.9%, referring to the apartheid wall. So, but that's just one friction of an example. And I know we're out of time and it's not really my area of specialty, but any Google search into Israel providing and supporting genocide in Rwanda, in Burma, you'll see how it's played a role for decades, exporting repression into the rest of the world. So it is more crucial for us to connect those together, and again, maybe to get more creative, and not, it's important to focus on the big picture and the importance of funding and stopping the funds to Israel, but also, again, like holding this middleman and these middle-size or even large-size big tech players, and how they are fueling and participating in the mass slaughter of innocent Palestinians in Gaza.
Thank you both for your thoughts on this. I wish we had more time. There's obviously so much more to talk about, but I'm sure you'll be writing about it and talking about it for the months to come. Before we sign off, I just want to remind everyone that these policy labs are a crowd-funded program of Al-Shabaka, so we'd be very thankful for any contributions that you could make. And if you're able to donate, please do so by clicking the donate button that should have just appeared. And thank you all for joining us on a Tuesday morning, evening, wherever you are, taking time out of your day, and stay tuned for Al-Shabaka's next policy lab next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.